Thank you so much. All right. Well, as you know, we're still in the fourth step here, poetic analysis. We'll be here a little bit longer. And in this step, we've completed the first three, and last week started in the fourth step, which is the imagery, poetic devices that are used in the poem. And we're going to start back in that particular step. And to do that, I'm going to have us go ahead and read the poem. And we'll just do a quick review on the imagery in the poem. And again, the important features with looking at images is poetry is full of imagery, and so we need to really make sure that we see those images. And again, particularly understanding how would the original audience have understood that image? What does that image contribute as far as the emotions of the poem? And then really, as we focused on last week, focus, in ourselves, making a mental picture of that image, drawing it in our mind based on what the poet is describing. Those are all very important aspects of Hebrew poetry. And as we talked about, the way to answer these questions is to read the poem slowly and really carefully and several times, and really give thought to the images that are being portrayed and what they're expressing. So let's review that step by reading this psalm once again to remind ourselves, and we'll do as we have been doing before. We'll read 3 verses each. I'll ask Pastor Renee to start, to read verses 1 through 3, and then Pastor Tabs, and then Pastor Entz, the last 3 verses. So, Pastor Renee, why don't you go ahead?
The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He is enthroned above the cherubim, let the earth shake. The Lord is great in Zion, and he is exalted above all the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he.
Pastor Tabs.
Sorry. The strength of the king loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. Holy is he. Moses and Aaron were among his priests, and Samuel was among those who called on his name. They called upon the Lord, and he answered them.
He spoke to them in a pillar of cloud. They kept his testimonies and the statute that he gave them. O Lord, our God, you answered them. You were a forgiving God to them, and yet an avenger of their evil deeds. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy hill, for holy is the Lord our God.
Thank you so much. And as we discussed before, the 2 primary images that we see here presented in the poem, in the first verse, is this image of God on the throne, representing his universal sovereign rule over all the earth, and the people's response should be one of fear and reverence. And then the rest of the psalm presents this image of God's rule over his people, specifically the mention of Zion, the mention of Jacob, and the call to exalt and worship on his holy hill. We see a shift. That first verse, sort of the image of God over the whole earth ruling, and then the second image is one of him ruling over his people. And so these 2 images really emphasize God's greatness as seen in his holiness, that he's worthy of our humble worship. And so that was sort of the summary of where we landed last week in looking at the imagery that we see here. And now and then after that, we jumped into the second step of the imagery and poetic analysis, and that was to identify the figurative language. The imagery, the emotion, the creative, artistic value of these poems is often expressed, or the tools of that is figurative language. And so, as we discussed last time, figurative language is a word or phrase that doesn't have its normal expected literal meaning. In fact, I used a couple of terms. I mentioned Brother Harris was in a fog earlier. That was actually a figurative expression that I used. At least we use it here in the States. to mean, somebody who isn't clear on something, who is confused, that we say that person is in a fog. Now, actually, Brother Harris might actually be in a literal fog, or he was smoking. I'm not sure yet, but that was sort of I used a figure of speech to kind of express something there. So we use figurative language not just in poetry, but in all different situations, but particularly find it in Hebrew poetry. And again, let's remember, figurative language, simply put, is that which conveys a literal truth in a non-literal way. All right, it's intended to convey meaning, but it does so in a non-literal way. All right, and so we started in looking at a few types of figures of speech. The first was the figurative language in the form of comparison, simile, metaphor, hypocatastasis. We looked at some examples of that last week, and I'm reviewing these briefly because what we're going to do this morning, Lord willing, is look at several different types of figures of speech, and then I'm gonna give you guys a verse, and we're gonna go around, and I'll have you identify or try to identify what figures of speech you see there, so we can get some practice in doing this. All right. So comparison. There's 3 forms of comparison that are used in figurative language: hyperbole, again, exaggeration to emphasize a point or to show emphasis. And then finally, or the third thing we looked at was the what I call attributing features. So personification, attributing human characteristics to an inanimate object or non-human object might be a better way to express that, because sometimes animals will have personification. Like someone might say, the dog spoke to me. Well, dogs don't speak using speech, they bark, but a personification might be to say he spoke to me. Anthropomorphism, that's attributing human characteristics to God. And then finally, zoomorphism, attributing animal characteristics to God. All right. So those were the 3 we looked at: comparison, hyperbole, and attributing features. All right. Let's continue to look at some other ones that other kinds of figurative language that we'll see. And another form is what's called, I call it substitution, meaning it's a figure of speech that one thing is being substituted for another. So for example, there's what's called metonymy. Anyone remember what metonymy is? What's a metonymy?
When you use something to represent the whole, Pastor, I think.
Yeah, one thing, close, one thing representing another. Like, for example, if you were to say, bow to the crown. Well, it's not saying, okay, that the crown, what does that expression mean, bow to the crown? Does that mean when you see a crown, you bow down to the crown, or are you bowing down to the person wearing the crown? Right? So that's a metonymy. Sort of the crown is a replacement, or represents the king or the queen or the prince, whoever's wearing the crown. All right? So for example, in Revelation 1, verse 12, then I turned to see the voice that was speaking with me. And having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. Now, can we see a voice? No, if you can, then maybe you're smoking the same thing Brother Harris is smoking in there. But no, we can't see a voice. So the voice there is a metonymy. The voice is representing, in this case, the Lord Jesus Christ in John's vision in chapter 1 of Revelation. He turned to see the voice, and actually he was seeing Christ. But it was a voice he heard, and so he used that expression there, and that's called a metonymy. All right? Now, a metonymy is not based on a comparison. It's simply one noun replacing another, one word or phrase which represents something else, and there may not be a logical connection. Now, in Revelation 1, verse 12, there is a logical connection because he heard someone speaking, and so he turned to see the voice. There's a logical connection there, but sometimes one thing that's replacing another may not have that logical connection. For example, bow to the crown is the crown there is a logical connection because it's representing the king or the queen. There's another expression called letting the cat out of the bag. Okay, I don't know if you've heard of that. It's an English idiom. It means that a secret has gotten out and now you're in big trouble. If you let the cat out of the bag, it's like, uh-oh, now this person has found out this secret and now I'm in trouble. But so there's no connection to a cat coming out of a bag and a secret being revealed. All right. Some believe this expression actually came from on ships in the Middle Ages. If a slave was disobedient, there was a whip that was kept in a bag, and the whip was called a cat of nine tails. And so it'd be taken out to bring punishment. Some people say that's where it came from. But my point is just simply this. Sometimes the metonymy is not connected logically. All right. In the case of the crown, it is connected. The crown is on the head of kings and queens, so it would represent their authority. But in this case of letting the cat out of the bag, the meaning of that figurative expression is not logical, or there's no connection with a cat in a bag and revealing a secret. All right. Hopefully, does that make sense? We'll see that sometimes, and we'll see metonymies in Scripture, and we'll think, well, now how can this represent this? Because there's no obvious connection. That's just the way sometimes figures of speech work in regards to metonymy. Okay, so but when you think metonymy, just think this one thing representing another. All right, one thing sort of serving in replacement of another. Okay, any questions on that? Metonymy. Morning, Pastor Jason. Welcome. Brother Gary, good morning. Okay, let's go to. Hi, it's good to hear you. Another one, and I think this one should sound familiar. It's one that I can never spell right. Synecdoche. Anyone know what synecdoche? It's another form of substitution. I think Pastor Tabbs, this is the one you were referring to a minute ago. What is a synecdoche?
And one thing represents the whole. That's what I said a while ago.
Yeah, part of something that represents all of it, or the whole. So, for example, if we were to say the hand of God moved, well, this actually is two figures of speech, right? One is what? The hand of God. What we've already seen this one. What is it?
Anthropomorphism.
There you go. A human attribute applied or used in reference to God. But this is also a synecdoche. When it's saying the hand of God moved among the people, it's not just the hand, it's a hand representing all of God. God's presence was among the people. All right, so this is synecdoche. It's not metonymy because it's actually part of the object that it represents. All right, a metonymy is something different than what it's representing. All right, not connected. Like the crown is not part of the king. All right, it's something else that represents the king. But in this case, in a synecdoche, it's a part of the actual object representing the whole object. So for example, here in Psalm 1:1, how blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. This man actually is a representative of any man, all mankind, anyone, any person, any human being who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. He's not talking about just one man, but he's saying in general, if any man is this way, he's a blessed man. Or Psalm 24, verse 6, this is the generation of those who seek him, who seek your face, even Jacob. Now, was the psalmist here, who's David, was he talking only about the man Jacob? That only Jacob seeks God's face? No. Pastor Jason, who does Jacob represent here?
It could be the Jews or the Israelites.
Yeah, Jacob represents Israel here.
Israel.
And this is a synecdoche because Jacob is actually a member of Israel. In fact, he's the first member of Israel. His name is also called Israel, but Jacob is a part of the whole. Okay? So That's why in this passage, he's not talking just about Jacob. If he was speaking of literal Jacob, it just would be one man, but he's speaking figuratively where Jacob represents all the people of Israel. And this type of figure of speech is called synecdoche. One more example, Obadiah verse 6. Oh, how Esau will be ransacked. Okay, and here Esau represents the land of Edom. Esau was the father of the Edomites. So again, like Jacob, he's not talking here about the one man Esau. He's speaking of the nation of Edom, where Esau was one part of that nation and represents that nation. Okay, this is this form of synecdoche is actually called, if you care, if you don't, ignore this just for a minute, but I know some of you guys are really into Hebrew poetry and you just love it so much, so you want to know everything you can about it. And you want to be able to show everybody how smart you are. So you're going to use all these terms like synecdoche and hypocatastasis. Well, here's another one for you, all right? Eponymy. It sounds like metonymy, but it's eponymy, and that is an individual who stands for the whole. Now, we're only going to use synecdoche because it's going to get confusing with too many expressions. In fact, I looked on a website for figures of speech, and there's like 50 or 60 of them. Oh, yeah, man, that's too many. We're just going to focus on the 15 or so that are most commonly found in Scripture. But an eponymy is that an individual stands for a whole. But we're not going to use that. I just wanted to be aware of that. Synecdoche is the same idea. Synecdoche is the general term for anything that represents is a part of the whole. Eponymy is specifically when we're speaking of a person who stands in place of the whole. All right. But again, don't worry so much about that. I just, for those of you who are interested, keep with the idea of synecdoche, part of something that represents all of it. Okay. Any questions so far? How are we doing? Just break in if any question comes to mind. Here's another one. It's called apostrophe. Now, apostrophe, I'll give an example, and then maybe one of you can tell me what it is. An apostrophe is seen in Psalm 42, 1 through 5. I've highlighted it in bold. As the deer pants for the water brook, so my soul pants for you, O God. Why are you in despair, O my soul? Why have you become disturbed within me? Who can tell me, what is apostrophe here? Anyone see it?
It is you. It is he who is being addressed.
Yeah, direct address. He's speaking directly to someone as if he's in a conversation with that person. Where really it's only one person speaking, David here in this case. I think it's David. I don't remember in Psalm 42. Maybe the sons of Korah. But here the psalmist is directly addressing someone else as if they're in a conversation together. And so we just saw direct address to someone who may, to someone else. All right. So yeah, the term like, "Oh Lord, oh my soul." Notice here he uses two different people, he directly addresses two different persons. One is God in verse 1, and then his own soul in verse 5, as if his soul was somebody else. All right. So what is the effect of this, to do this? Why doesn't if he had said, "As the deer pants for the water brooks, my soul pants for you," and then he adds, "Oh God," what does that do? What is the effect of that? Brother
It
Tabs?
increases intensity.
Speaks
Or
of
it increases intensity of the emotion.
Okay. Conveys emotion. Pastor Jason?
can be speaking of a close relationship.
Yeah, there's an intimacy there, isn't there? As well. Yeah, it's personal, isn't it? It makes it more personal. If I were just to say, to Pastor Jan, if I were just addressing him and saying, it's good to see you. But what if I'd said, it's good to see you, oh, my brother, or it's good to see you, oh Pastor Jan, or that's more personal, isn't it? It's good to see you, guapong kalbo, right? I mean, that makes it more of a personal connection as opposed to just making the statement. We see a lot of this in poetry, Hebrew poetry especially. Now, I don't know where the term apostrophe came from, because normally when we think of apostrophe in English, we think of those quotes, right? Or that's a quote, sorry, apostrophe is like this, like don't. D-O-N apostrophe T. I don't know why it's also referring to direct address. Again, I apologize for the English language. That's the way it is. But when you think direct address, you could call it that as well. That's to me a clearer term. But apostrophe is the technical term that is used among poetic scholars, which we want to be poetic scholars, right? So we'll use apostrophe. Makes us sound smarter. All right. Another form of figures of speech is called irony. All right. Let me ask DJ, are you there? Brother DJ?
Yes, Pastor Tim, I'm here.
Can you let us know what is irony? How would you define irony?
It states the exact opposite of what the author meant.
Okay, good. It states or means, maybe we could put it that way, states or means the opposite of what the author said. The author intentionally means something different or even opposite. Sometimes it's just different to what he says or what the audience would think. So it's like, for example, when I said earlier that Brother Harris is in a fog. Sorry, I don't mean to pick on you, Brother Harris, but I said something where I meant actually something different. It could have been he's in a literal fog, but I didn't mean that. I was making a joke about him, being in a state of confusion because of the fog around him. And so that was an irony. I meant something different than what I was seemingly conveying. Okay? So, for example, in Judges, you can see here, Judges 10, the Lord speaking, you have forsaken me and served other gods, therefore I will no longer deliver you. Go and cry out to the gods which you have chosen. Let them deliver you in the time of your distress. Now, verse 14, did God really mean that? Did he really mean, go cry out to the gods you have chosen, let them deliver you? No, that was an irony. Because one, there's no such thing as these false gods. They're idols. And two, these idols won't deliver them. And so God was using irony, sarcasm here, as a biting statement towards them, meaning you're going to worship these things, let them be the gods who deliver you. Go cry out to them. All right? So he meant something different than what he was communicating. All right? He really saying, don't go to them, come to me. If you're going to depend on them, go pray to them, and they'll take care of you. They'll deliver you. Well, he knows that's not the case. It was an ironic statement to get their attention. Okay? And we'll see irony sometimes in poetry. All right? Any comments or questions so far?
Tim, how about Amerism?
We'll get there. Amerism as part of what?
It's like an exaggeration.
Amerism,
or a substitution.
It is. It functions similarly, but it has a different intention. We'll get there in I think. Let me see. Two more. Let me cover one, and then we'll go to Amerism, and we can talk about that. Okay. Let's do wordplay, because this comes up a lot in Hebrew poetry. Wordplay, basically, we think we could also refer to them as a pun, where it's a clever use of words that sound or look similar to each other. In other words, for example, here's one in Jeremiah 3:22. Return, O faithless sons, I will heal your faithlessness. Behold, we come to you, for you are Yahweh our God. Literally here, if we were to, again, in our step where we look at the interlinear, we would have seen this. The literal translation is this: turn, O sons of turning, I will heal your turning. All right? It doesn't come out in the English translation it comes out a little bit. You can see it in the bold words, that word faithless and faithlessness. So the English translators tried to match it there a little bit, but when we go to the literal translation, it's actually uses this Hebrew word shuv 3 times. Turn, shuv, and then another form of it, sons of turning, and I will heal your turning. All right, that's a word play. It's taking a particular word or the same root and using it in different ways, all right, to convey a point. It gets attention, right? We use puns a lot, and it's actually a really skillful way to draw attention to a concept that you're using. And in class, we went through Micah chapter 1, and that's probably, to me, one of the most stunning displays of wordplay that I've found, because the author Micah, as he's proclaiming judgment upon several small cities that were actually near his hometown, each of these cities had a particular meaning. I think one was Beth Ephra, which means house of dust. And he says, O Beth Ephra, you will turn to dust, because of the judgment coming. So he used the name of the city or the town, and he used that as expression and then used the same word to describe how judgment will come upon that particular place. And so he said, like in Bethlehem, you will die of starvation, right? Bethlehem means house of food, but he said you would have no food. So that's the idea. The challenge with wordplay is usually the words in Hebrew, right? So we may not, like in this verse, Jeremiah 3, we wouldn't see the word shuv, we see the translation. But unfortunately, the translators here did not translate faithless and return and faithlessness. Those are all the same Hebrew word, that root word shuv. But the translators should have translated all 3 of these words. I would have said, return, O sons of turning, and I will heal your turning. All right, that might not be as clear in meaning, but the wordplay would come out. And I think the concept would be clear. Turn from what you're doing, you people who like to turn away, and I will heal you from that heart that desires to turn away. Okay? So I think sometimes the translators could help out a little bit by just putting in the literal, those words in terms of their literal meaning, and then people would see the figurative expression being used there. Oftentimes you'll see that, like in Micah 1, when you see a Hebrew word, they'll actually just leave the Hebrew word in. For example, let me just show it to you. I think it'll be easier to do that. Let me share. No, that's not it. Where'd it go? There it is. Let me just show you this real quick. First, I'll show you Jeremiah 3:22. Okay, here's the verse. Now, I'm just going to, because I know last time when we looked at the Hebrew, we were talking about those accent marks. You guys were like so interested that I know you just love it when we put Hebrew up here. So I'm going to do it again. But here, let me just see if I can point out just see if you see the pattern here. This is a sheen, wow, baith, all right? That's shuv, the word shuv. It means to turn, literally. Now you see these same letters in this word here. All right, so it's turn, sons of turning, or turning sons. And then he says, I will heal And then it's harder to see here, but do you see those Hebrew letters? They're right there as well. And this actually, literally, this letter is from, and this is you. So literally, it's turn, command, sons of turning, and then I will heal you from your turning. It's the idea. All right, so within 5 Hebrew words, 3 of them are the same root word. That, if you were a Hebrew speaker, that would stick out to you, like instantly. Like that's unique, that's different. And what that does is, like a pun in our, when we use puns or wordplay in our language, it gets people's attention, not only as being clever, but it's like, oh, it sticks out. It makes you pause a minute and think about what he's saying. And that's exactly the intent here. Jeremiah wanted, or God through Jeremiah wanted the people to stop and recognize they needed to turn, they needed to repent. Probably a better word would be repent, but the idea of the concept of this word that literally means to turn, these people had a pattern of turning away from right toward wrong. That's why they translate it faithless. And so he says, turn from being those who keep turning, and I will heal you from that pattern of turning in your life, so to speak, turning away from God, away from the truth, away from what's right. Okay? Let me show you the Micah passage, and we'll do this one in English. Let me use NAS. So here was an example. At Bethlehem Ephraim, roll in the dust. Well, here, actually, sometimes the translators will help us out. They left the Hebrew word in, but notice there's a footnote. You guys see that? You see what the footnote means? Literally, this Hebrew word is house of dust. All right? And so the town's name was Beth Ephraim, house of dust. And so Micah says, you house of dust, are going to roll in the dust. And that was a picture of being destroyed. Or the next one, go on your way, inhabitant of, and here's another Hebrew word that the translators left in, but notice what it is. The word means pleasantness. So it was a town called Shaphir, and the word has this idea of pleasantness. But he says, go on your way, and it won't be in a pleasant way, will it? You'll be stripped. Like in the picture here, here's an image. They're the people of the town, when the army would come in and defeat them, in order to shame them, they would strip them naked and have them march. And so here, that's the picture. So that's not very pleasant, is it? You had to march in front of everybody naked without any clothing. And so this idea of you who live in this town called Pleasant are going to go through an unpleasant experience. Okay? And we could keep going. The lamentation of, there's this town Beth Ezel, which means house of removal. And they're going to be saying, God has removed us. All right? So you see the idea here. And so Micah goes through each verse, city after city after city, and uses this wordplay, and it really brings the point home strongly. Okay? So that is wordplay. And the best way to find that out is there's 2 ways. One is the translation will have like a footnote or something that, as I show here. Notice all of these Hebrew town names. There's a footnote given, most of them anyway. So you'll notice it in a footnote, or you'll notice it when you do your comparison in the interlinear, like when we talked about when you're doing parallelism and you use the interlinear. So those are a couple of ways. Or sometimes if you don't catch it, sometimes a resource that you're using, that you're consulting, might point it out to you. All right. Now, when you're preaching, you don't have to go through all of this necessarily to your people. They may get bogged down in this, but so this is the challenge. How would you convey what the poet is trying to do through this wordplay? How would you convey that as you preach without going through this long Hebrew word explanation? which most people will be going, what are you talking about? Any thoughts on that? And this, I ask this because also, just in general, we discussed it last week with imagery. The great challenge in Hebrew poetry is to not just give the meaning of the text, but actually convey that meaning in the way the poet conveys it, so that then the people will receive it as it was intended to be received. Not just giving the interpretation, but also how that interpretation is given with emotion, with emphasis at the right places. So that's why I asked this question. How would you, any thoughts about how you might preach when there's a wordplay that you discover? How might that come out in your sermon? Not easy, is it?
Tim, I
Yeah.
probably, for example, looking at this Micah chapter 1 passage from 10 and 11, I preach it by showing how much more intense or emphatic the prophet was regarding the judgment of God. I might mention the play of words here and the irony, for example, in verse 11 of the name Shafir, who would be walking in shameful nakedness. Just simply mentioning the picturesque nature of the wordplay to emphasize the intensity of the coming judgment.
Yeah, so you would take maybe a couple of examples and just sort of give them an idea, so they get a feel for what's going on, but without having to go through everything here, because he uses quite a few. I think there's 10 or 12 towns that he does this with here, or at least 8. Good. Any other thoughts or ideas there? How you might convey this in preaching?
As far as I would try to look at the reason first behind the wordplay and focus on why the author would have put that wordplay there, and try to convey the intention or the emotion of why it's there, and try to find out how I'll be able to, like, the returning or backsliding, or the faithless, the one a while ago.
Yeah.
I try to first look at why is it there and what was it for, and then try to focus on that meaning behind that wordplay.
Yeah, good. I think that's a good example. I think both of those things, if you have a long list like in Micah, I think, yeah, just doing a couple makes sense. In Jeremiah, it's just the one statement that's a wordplay, so I think it'll be helpful to do that. And then what I'd suggest in addition to those things is come up with one or two of your own in either Tagalog or Cebuano or Ilonggo, whatever you're preaching in. Come up with one of your own that would connect with the people. So, for example, what I did with this passage, I put too much detail. I think I went through several of these. So don't listen to my sermon on this text, because I'm violating what I actually did. All right, but I think if I were preaching this today, I would follow Pastor Robbie's suggestion, which is just take one or two, and so they get the idea. And then, but what I did do that I would do again is I took a couple of cities that they were familiar with, and I did the same thing. So, for example, there's a town in our area here called Sun City, S-U-N. So what I said is, You know, for example, it would be as if I were to say, Sun City will grow dark. You know, they would get that. Or another example, Los Angeles in Spanish means, you know, it's the angels. So, you know, Los Angeles is called City of Angels. And I'd say, or Los Angeles will be full of demons. Okay. So because people know what the meaning of the name Los Angeles is, they would get right away, you know, that what I'm conveying is that it's not a place of angels, it's a place of wickedness. But I say that in using a word play in order to convey something. And so I would use a few examples. So if I were preaching this, if you're preaching this in Tagalog or Ilocano, use an expression, use a nearby town where people would know the meaning, and then play, you know, do a play on words from that location. Or sometimes a place is known for something that it does. You know, there's a town in California here that every year they have a garlic festival. You know, garlic, that's seasoning. And so you might want to use, it's called Gilroy is the name of the town. So sometimes a word play won't be on the meaning of the name of a place, but maybe what that place is known for. So for example, we might say, you know, it will be bitter. I don't know how to use garlic. I don't know how to say how garlic might taste. It'll be bitter in Gilroy, or there will be no festival. There will be no festival in Gilroy this year. The idea there, because every year they had a garlic festival. So if you were from around there, you'd know about that. And I bring that up because, for example, Lachish is not, the word doesn't mean horses here. Here he says, harness the chariot to the team of horses, O inhabitant of Lachish. But Lachish was known for its chariots. And so here he was basically saying, you know, you're going to need to load up your chariots because an army's coming. All right. So he used something that the place was known for and made it a play on that. All right. So again, a lot of skill that Micah employed here, actually. And so I would just suggest, don't spend a lot of time trying to interpret the meaning there. Just maybe go through an example, but then in the passage, but then also use an example of your own that will convey the idea. And then people go, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. All right? Does that make sense? As I said, the great challenge in preaching poetry is being able to, you know, convey these things so that it's not just sort of a information dump, you know, where you're explaining all these Hebrew poetic terms and then they're missing the whole emotion, the whole intent behind the approach. And, you know, like if you were to say, notice here in this passage in Psalm 24, the use of apostrophe. Apostrophe is to, when you use a direct address, you know, you go into that explanation, you've just sort of taken this beautiful piece of poetry that conveys emotion and imagery, and you're like, wah, 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 right? It saps the whole power of the poem when you try to teach it like an epistle. You know, an epistle, we break things down, you know, and this word really, you know, modifies this word, and that conveys this idea, and, you know, it's a little more technical sometimes. You can't do that with poetry. It really takes away from what the intended effect is. So this is what makes poetry rather a challenge to preach. But we're given all of these types of figures of speech, and, you know, we looked before at parallelism, especially like chiasm. We're given these kinds of things that these poets will use in order to direct our attention to particular things, in order to increase emotion or focus or emphasis, and in order to help us see better what he's trying to describe, but also to feel what he's trying to describe. So again, this is the great challenge as preachers. I'll keep talking about this as we go along, but I just always want you to be thinking about, okay, I've got this, I've identified this figure of speech, or I've identified this form of parallelism. How does that help me preach this text? And how do I convey what I've seen here in a way that the original author intended for his audience to receive it. Okay? Any further thoughts or questions before we go on to the next figure of speech? Okay. Let's go back to the notes, and we'll hit the figure of speech that Pastor Robbie had asked about a moment ago. And that is, the next one we're looking at is what we call merism. All right? This doesn't mean to be happy, all right? It's not merry. It's merism. And a merism is expressed in the example in Psalm 72. May he also rule from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Who can tell me what is a merism? What kind of figure of speech is that? Anyone give me a definition?
Streams or
Uh-oh.
to represent the whole or something like that.
Can you repeat
Like
that?
sometimes
You froze up. Can you repeat that?
it's the use of extremes or contrasts to represent the whole. Like what comes to mind is day and night. I think like in Psalm 1, or day and night.
My tears were my food day and night.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty good. It's two maybe contrasting, or we could say dissimilar words used to communicate, I would say, the totality. All right? So it's not like the whole, it's more the idea of totality. So when we say day and night, that's like all the time, right? It's speaking of time. Or here in Psalm 72, they're not contrasting words, but he says from sea to sea. So he's using these expression to represent the totality. From sea to sea just means, literally all across the land. All right? So that's the idea. I would say it's two contrasting or dissimilar words. Usually, in this case, they're similar words, sea and sea, but that are used to communicate totality. Sometimes you'll see male and female, man and woman, day and night, sea to sea, from one end to the other, east to west, Psalm 103. All right, those are all merism. It's not just, it's not a substitution. It's not a synecdoche. It's not a part of something representing the whole. It's actually looking at two things that represent both extremes of something, to speak of a totality. It's a form of almost a form of hyperbole. Day and night, all the time. And he said, my tears have been my food day and night. Well, does that mean literally every second of every, all day, every day? It's been that way, or is he just using sort of a hyperbole to express it's just happening? It feels like all the time. It's hyperbole, but in this case, the merism is that he uses two words that are the extremes of something. Yeah.
How about the expression as far as the east is from the west? Is that a merism?
I would call it a merism, yeah, because east and west are the extremes. All right, it's as far as that direction is from that direction, and of course we know scientifically, the Earth is round, and so we would know, they never meet. But I don't think he's speaking scientifically there. He's speaking figuratively. As far as you can look in that direction, and as far as you can look in that direction, that's how far our sins have been taken from us. All right, I don't think I've heard preachers talk about, and so we know the east never meets the west because the earth is round, so he's saying it'll never happen. I don't think that quite captures the idea. Again, the original audience, they would not have known about the earth being round. But they certainly would have known, as I look in that direction, it's the complete opposite of that direction. And actually, for me, this is west and this is east. But so they would understand that just from their perspective, that this just represents, opposites. So it's like the whole thing is what's communicated. So yes, I would say, I think Psalm 103 verse I forget, 12, 14, somewhere in there. As far as east is from the west, so far as he taken our sins from us. From the rising of the sun to its setting. That's another merism, meaning all day. Or I think actually that reference is speaking of direction. The sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. I think he's speaking of the same ideas for east and west. Depends on the psalm. Okay? Merism. Any questions?
Pastor Tim,
Yes.
yeah. How about some of the things mentioned in Romans 8:38? Although it's an epistle, there are contrasting words also there. Like, for I am sure that neither death nor life nor nor height nor depth nor things present nor things to come. Are those merisms also employed?
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
great question. Let me pull that up. Okay, hopefully you guys can see Romans 8:38. He says, neither death nor life. You guys see this? Neither death nor life. Now, are those opposites? They are, right? Angels nor principalities. Now, this word principality is often in reference to demonic forces. Paul usually uses it that way. So are angels and principalities opposites? Yeah, angels and demons. Nor things present, nor things to come. Present, future. Verse 9, nor height, nor depth. Yeah, I think he's using merism here. And he's using it a lot. And it has a poetic effect. It's very powerful. He's using both extremes to indicate a totality here. All right? There's nothing, to die or to live. Angels or demons. Things present, things in the future. Height, depth. Anything created. Nothing can separate us from this. So he's using this to really pound emphasis. Paul uses a lot of Hebrew poetry expressions. You'll notice. I see them often in his letters. And it makes sense. He's a Hebrew scholar. He'd be very familiar with Hebrew poetry. And I see in Colossians chapter 1, he uses chiasm there. I see it in 1 Timothy 3, when he talks about Christ there in 1 Timothy 3:16. I think he uses a sort of a form of a hymn there. Philippians chapter 2, when he speaks of Christ, there's a chiasm that he uses there as well, and repetition. I think here in Romans 8:38 and 39, he's using merism and repetition. Okay, so look, I think the value in doing this, men, Hebrew poetry, you might think, how I'm gonna preach through the epistles till I die. I'm not gonna do any Hebrew Old Testament stuff. Who cares about the Old Testament? It's about the church. You need to care about the Old Testament because a lot of these things bleed in. So if you're preaching Romans 8:38 and 39, you better see the poetic devices that Paul is using there because of the effect of it and how it really is emphasizing something. And we even feel that emphasis, don't we? Just even reading it here without even recognizing what he's doing. But it is really helpful if you can notice or detect when the New Testament writers use poetic devices, figures of speech, and there are a lot. In fact, I will show you. We'll do a couple passages. I don't know if we'll get to them today from the New Testament, where you will see Hebrew poetry being used, and maybe in a passage that you wouldn't expect it. All right. So I'm just saying that so you'll stay on the Zoom call here, not leave me. All right. So stay tuned. It's pretty neat. But here's thank you for bringing this up, Brother Harris, because this is a great example of New Testament usage of Hebrew poetic devices. Did that answer your question, Brother Harris?
Yes, Pastor King. Yeah.
I know
Thank
it's a
you.
long answer, but hopefully that's clear. All right, so merism. Merism. Any other questions before we go to the next figure of speech?
There is also in Job chapter 2, when Job had a boil, it says from the tip of his foot to the crown of his head.
Yes.
So
where's that at? Job?
Job chapter 2, verse
Job.
7.
Job
Verse 7.
2. Yeah. Oops. Job 2:7. To the weary. I'm not seeing it. You've given the water
Job.
from
Job.
Job.
Job chapter 2, verse 7.
Yeah, I don't see it there.
Says, then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head.
Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. Yep, yeah. So that would be an expression used in narrative to describe, from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head. That's it. That is a merism. It's representing the two ends. Speaking of the two ends that represent totality, or all of him. Okay. He could have just said he smote Job with boils all over his body. But here, by saying from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head, really creates emphasis that it was over his whole body. Okay, good. All right. Let me get back to our. Okay, just a couple more of these and we'll go through some examples. This one's called interjection. That's a word or phrase that is inserted for emphasis. One common word that we see in Hebrew poetry is the word behold. Okay? Behold, hene is a Hebrew word. And it's this idea of stop, look, pay attention. All right, and you'll see it in a poem where you'll be reading, and all of a sudden there's that word behold. That's sort of a kind of a dead stop in the poem. Like, okay, it's like if you're in a conversation and then the person pauses and maybe grabs your arm or your shoulder and says, okay, now listen to me right now. This is important. All right, so that interjection sort of has that effect. And we see another example of it in Psalm 120. Woe is me. That was a Hebrew word expression there of, it's as if I feel like I'm in a funeral. Woe is me, for I sojourn in Meshech. I dwell among the tents of Kedar. All right? So an interjection, a word or phrase inserted for emphasis. Okay?
Pastor Tim?
Yes.
I know Selah is not part of the Bible, but can you, say that it's also an interjection?
Huh. It's more of a Salah is. I would not call it an interjection because it is really more of instruction given to the reader or musician to pause. So it's like it's not a word you would read. It's one that's just. I don't know if you're familiar, like with movie scripts, where on a movie script it'll have the man, and it'll be his line. He says, "Come over here, son," and then you'll see in parentheses the father points to the door. All right?
Yeah.
So the
Uh-huh.
parentheses, you don't read that. You know, the guy doesn't say that.
Uh-huh.
His line is, come over here, son. But there's direction given to him in the script. Salah is kind of like that, where you don't read the word. It's more like it's in parentheses telling the reader or the musicians to pause for a moment for reflection. All right. So whereas an interjection is an actual word that you would read that isn't giving instruction per se, but it's put there as sort of an emphasis to get attention. All right. That's a great question, though.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Would you suggest then that in scripture reading that we just just pause without necessarily reading the word Selah?
Yes. Yeah, just pause for a second or two. That's what I do.
Yeah.
I used to read the word Salah because I thought I'm being, after seminary, I thought, trying to show off my great Hebrew skills, and actually it was showing how stupid I was because you're not supposed to read the word.
Okay.
So I'm
Yeah.
sorry if you guys read the word. I'm not calling you stupid, but actually it's just intended to be there as as I said, a comment to the reader to pause. So yeah, I would just pause for a second or two, not long, but just enough to kind of have the effect that the author intended there to be. All right.
Yeah, especially if we let's say read it with feelings, just like what you said earlier, that we should speak slowly and really let the emotion of the passage, caught, catch you up, to really captivate your feeling and just speak as slowly and pausing as necessary.
Yeah, that's a good explanation or summary of that. And again, we're back to just reminding ourselves of the idea of Hebrew poetry is not meant to be read or it's not meant to be read like we would read an epistle or a narrative. So even the word Selah, the instruction or direction from the word Selah, reminds us of that there's deliberateness, there is slowness in a sense, pondering, emotion, all these things that need to be considered when reading poetry. Okay.
Okay.
Great question.
Yeah, thank you, Pastor. Thank you.
Great question. Okay. Any other comments or questions about interjections before we go to the next?
How about the words of Jesus, Pastor Tim? Verily, verily. Are
Yes.
they? Yeah.
Yeah. Jesus. So there's actually a Greek word. There's the Hebrew word. It's hene would be the way you pronounce it. That's the idea of behold, look, stop, and consider. There's a Hebrew word called idu, is the way it's expressed, which basically means the same thing as the Hebrew word, the Greek word idu, and so that would be translated that way too. And there's other expressions that are used in Greek that Jesus used. Truly, truly, or verily, verily. If your King Jimmy-ness is coming out there, Brother Harris, that's a King James expression. Be careful there. But yeah, verily, verily would be that. Jesus used the word woe a lot when he was speaking to one particular group of people. Do you remember? Woe to you, the Pharisees. That's a interjection. All right. Behold, of course, is used often by Jesus and other New Testament writers. Okay, good. Those are good examples. All right, idiom. Idioms are a little bit more difficult. They're an expression whose meaning is not obvious. Or I'd say discernible from the words used. So, for example, the expression to heap burning coals on his head. Remember, that's a proverb that was used, that do good to somebody else. In fact, Paul, I think, quotes from it in Romans chapter 12. If you show kindness to someone that's been mean to you, that's like heaping burning coals on his head. And you think, what? Why would I do that to somebody who's been kind to me? That would hurt. Wouldn't that burn their skull? That you'd end up looking like Pastor Robbie. You'd have no hair. So that heaping burning coals, it's cold. Heaping burning coals on his head, that expression doesn't really make sense. It's an idiom. It's like the other one that I used earlier, the let the cat out of the bag. And again, that has the idea of a secret being revealed that will get the person in trouble. All right? But you wouldn't know that from that expression necessarily. Sometimes it's obvious, but other times it's not. It's an idiom. It's a phrase or a group of words that over time has come to mean something that's not obvious from the words themselves. Again, like I said, when you say let the cat out of the bag, the picture there is, you have a bag and you open it up and a cat comes out. Well, that doesn't really make any sense. What does that mean? Well, the literal meaning is not the idea. The figurative meaning is, like I said, it's like a secret that's let out that will cause somebody trouble. It's become an idiom. And heaping burning coals on a person's head as a sign of showing them kindness, that's an idiom. That expression doesn't really make sense until you understand what it is intended to mean. Every culture, every language has idioms. In fact, I've noticed when I preach, in other countries in English, I go through my sermons to make sure I try to take out the idioms, as many as I can, because a lot of them may not make sense to an audience of people who aren't from America. When I do that, I notice, wow, there's a lot of idioms that I use, just everyday expressions that don't mean what the words themselves literally mean. They mean something else. So for example, Psalm 72, let the nomads of the desert bow before him and his enemies lick the dust. You see that? Now, did the psalmist here mean literally that that he wanted his enemies to bow down to the ground and begin licking the dirt? No, it's an idiom. What does that idiom mean, you think? Can somebody tell me? For his enemies to lick the dust.
To be truly humbled, extremely humbled.
Yeah, to be humbled. Like you're brought so low that you're actually as if you're licking the dust on the ground. Remember, in the ancient Near East, the ancient Near East is what I'm A-N-E. In the ancient Near East, when an enemy army was defeated, one thing that would be done is the leader of that army or the king of that nation would be brought before the conquering ruler, and the conquering ruler would place his foot on the neck of the defeated king. So it's like the defeated king had his face right on the ground. So that expression lick the dust could also be a picture of that common practice to show he's been defeated. So it could be to be humbled, to be defeated, to be humiliated would be the idea of this expression. Okay? So that would be an idiom. A commonly used, I should probably put that, a commonly used expression whose meaning is not obvious or discernible from the words used, but has its own particular meaning. Okay? Any questions? We're almost done with this list, guys. Sorry. There's several of them, but I wanted to go through them. And we'll go through some examples here in a minute. Okay, one more. One more, and it's called the Rhetorical Question. Pastor Entz, what is a rhetorical question?
A question that does not necessarily require an answer, but it conveys the truth about it.
Yes, it really is a question that where the answer is obvious, and doesn't need to be given. Okay, so Romans 6:1. What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase? Well, was Paul going to sit there, and wait for an answer? No, he says it with the answer's obvious. All right. Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase? And then he actually, I think, answers it in the text. He says, may it never be. But it's a rhetorical question. So here, that's an example in Romans 6. Sometimes we have those, there's one example in Psalm 13, how long, O Lord? There's apostrophe. Will you forget me forever? All right. It's a rhetorical question that he's expressing there. Okay. So here's a summary of the figures of speech that we've seen. All right. So we're just going to deal with these. Like I said, I've read in some places like 50 or 60 figures of speech that people have identified. So it gets a little ridiculous. But I think this group of figures of speech represents, I think, pretty much 98% of the kinds of figures of speech you'll see in Hebrew poetry. All right. So what we're going to do is take the rest of our time together, the next 30 minutes or so, and we're going to just go through several examples from Scripture, and I'll just call on each one of you and just have you read the passage, and then see if you can identify the figure of speech used, or some passages may have more than one. All right. So let's start. We'll start with Pastor Entz. All right. And I'm going to give you, all these passages are from New American Standard, unless otherwise noted. Psalm chapter 1, verse 3, Psalm 1:3. Read the verse, and then what figure of speech do you see here?
You will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season. Like a tree.
Okay, what kind of
Simile.
Yes, that's a simile. All right, which is a form of comparison, right? It's the weakest type of comparison. Okay? Good. Now, if it had said he is a tree, what would that be?
It's a metaphor.
Metaphor. It's a stronger comparison. It's using the word is instead of like. Okay, good. Pastor Robbie, I'm going to give you the next one. If you could read that, Pastor Robbie, if that leaves you on your signal. Read Psalm 98:8 and let us know what figure of speech do you see here. You're still muted.
Rivers clap their hands, let the mountains sing together for joy. It's personification.
Okay, good. Personification. And that is again what? What is personification?
Giving human attributes to inanimate things.
Okay, good. To non-human or inanimate objects. The mountains sing, the rivers clap. Well, they don't really do that, but he's conveying this idea of, he's emphasizing this idea of joy, of praise, so much so that even the rivers would participate, or the mountains. Okay?
Could that also be hyperbole?
I would say hyperbole if he said, let all the rivers, let all the mountains. or all the universe will sing for joy. That would be the exaggeration. I don't see the exaggeration here, just the personification. Okay? Or if he'd said, you know, yeah, I think those are close enough. Okay, Psalm 44, verse 6. Brother Pastor Atong, can you do this one for us?
For I will not trust in my bow, nor will my sword save me. For I will not trust in my bow, nor will my sword save me. I will trust,
This one's a little bit tougher.
nor will my sword.
Let me, it has to do with these two.
Sword. Representation.
Okay, they are representing something. What do they represent?
Representation.
I gave you one of the harder ones, so don't feel bad. Take your time.
Yeah. Is that Synecdoche?
Good, yeah. Synecdoche.
Yeah, Synecdoche.
Yeah, it's a hard word. But and it's Synecdoche, which again, remember, is a part of something that represents the whole. Now, in what way is a bow and a sword? What is that a part of?
The soldiers, probably.
Okay. Specifically, the soldier's weaponry.
Yes.
Right? Sword, shield, bow, arrow, spear, chariot. Right? I think David uses these two expressions, bow and sword, to sort of represent all, you know, his weaponry, his armaments, that none of his weaponry can save him. And so he uses a bow and a sword to represent those things. Okay, no weapon that I have can save me. I can't trust in them. So the bow and the sword represent those weapons. Sling, right? David used the sling at times. So I think that's this is a form of synecdoche. All right, but this was a hard one. You guys see that? It'd be like Doc Quinn, if he's saying, you know, the scalpel heals. Actually, there'd be a couple of figures of speech here, but one is synecdoche, because the scalp, it's not the scalpel, right? It's the scalpel in the surgeon's hand, directed to the right place, but also there are other instruments that are used, correct? Right, Doc Quinn? You don't just cut people, right? And so it's not only a synecdoche where the scalpel represents all that is used in surgery, but also the scalpel heals. What other form of figurative language is that? Figure of speech?
Hypocatastasis, I think.
Okay, how would it be that?
It's a stronger comparison, presenting the doctor. Instead of saying like the doctor is like a scalpel, or the doctor is a scalpel.
I see.
Who heals.
If the scalpel, well, if he's calling the doctor a scalpel, that would be, yeah. I wasn't actually using it in that way, but I see what you're saying. Yeah, if I was referring to Doc Quinn as the scalpel, so in other words, if I had said the scalpel heals, And if I had meant by that, Doc Quinn heals, that would be hypocatastasis. How I was seeing it, though, is the scalpel heals as a synecdoche, where the scalpel represents all that's used. Another thing that it is irony. What is a scalpel? A scalpel it's a very sharp knife, right? Normally, you don't think of a sharp knife as something, as a healing instrument. You think of it as a destructive instrument, and used a certain way, it could be. You know, if you use a scalpel like this, you know, I don't think you don't do it this way, right, Doc Quinn? Right? That's not how you use it surgically. So the scalpel, which can be used to harm, is used to heal. So that's an irony. Okay. So
Dr. Tim?
Yes, sir.
What about the personification?
Personification. Oh, yeah, I guess in a way, if you're, saying that the scalpel is sort of acting as a healing agent, where it's really the doctor. Yeah, I could see that. Good. So it's interesting here, right? You can see sort of some expressions have a number of different figures of speech. Brother Raleigh, are you?
Yeah. I was thinking, well, we know that the strength of an army really lies on the number of arms and number of ammunition of bows and arrows they have. So I mean, the strength of a kingdom is directly proportionate to the number of soldiers that they have. And yet here he says, I will not trust in these arms, but in the Lord. Of course, that's what it meant. But can we say that it's really what? Can we say that it's an irony, or it conveys something that is in fact, I don't know how would you put it? Do you get what I mean?
I think so. So something that you would depend on to help you doesn't. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
That could be an irony, and the challenge is the author intending to communicate that figure of speech. So in here, for example, Psalm 44 is the author intending this to be an irony. So you'd have to read the rest of the psalm in order to see the context. But yeah, it could be an irony in that way, that normally something you could trust in, like an army or a horse or a chariot, actually cannot be trusted in. It's sort of like that irony that we looked at in Judges, when God says, call out to your idols, let them save you. That was an irony, because the intent of the speaker there was the opposite of what he was saying. So,
right.
This is where sometimes, if you're not sure what kind of figure of speech is being used, it's helpful to note the context, the verses before and after, and I didn't put those here, and that will help you to determine which one he's intending to use.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Context will help us interpret which figure of speech is being intended by the poet. Okay, let's go to the next one. Psalm 22, verse 16. We are, Doc Quinn, we're to you. Can you go ahead and read this? And
For dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Wow. Number
one. Number one is hypocatastasis, the dogs. I think the dogs would refer to the enemy, and he's calling the author's calling them dogs.
Yeah, good. Notice here, he doesn't say those who are like dogs have surrounded me, or those who are dogs have surrounded me. He's saying dogs have surrounded me. So he's, and he doesn't mean literal dogs. We know this is figurative, and because it's figurative, he's actually, it's this hypocatastasis. And remember, the significance of this is that hypocatastasis is the strongest form of comparison. All right, so he's making this point strongly. He's saying, just saying dogs have surrounded me, not those who are like dogs. So this is a strong comparison. All right, do you see any other?
I'm not exactly sure with the two lines remaining. Band of evildoers, to be exact, and pierced my hands and feet. I'd like to think that the band of evildoers has encompassed me is Synecdoche. I am not really quite sure. And the pierced my hands and feet could be also a if a hyperbole, because really he's writing this and he's not really under duress being pierced and in the hands and feet, so it could be hyperbolic. That particular line, the third line, I'm not exactly sure how to deal with the second line. Band of evil, it could be also a hyperbole because of the word encompass. I'd like to think that he's trying to picture that he cannot move anymore because of the enemies surrounding him. Really, he still can move because he was able to write. Still, these things that he is saying here in this line, and then again also, then I would go back to that. They pierced my hands and feet, which again could be hyperbolic as well.
Okay, good. What do you guys think? Any thoughts on that? Do you agree, or do you see something different? See, in other words, using these expressions to sort of emphasize that, are they literally all around him? There's no space to get out, or does it feel like he's surrounded, that he cannot escape? And again, context would help us to know for sure, but I think, yeah, this is a possible hyperbole there. They pierced my hands and my feet. Very interesting, right? This is an expression that, of course, would give us the idea perhaps of a messianic tone, right? Because we know of someone whose hands and feet were pierced. So in this case, though, I think the author, David, here is using it as a figure of speech, where this is representing perhaps harm or death. Okay? And then we know prophetically, this is exactly what happened to Jesus. Psalm 22 is often referred to as a messianic psalm. All right? But don't confuse prophetic utterance with figure of speech. All right? A prophetic utterance would be a foretelling, a future telling statement or description, whereas a figure of speech would just be some word or phrase that is used, which doesn't, again, remember, it's a non-literal word or phrase that has a literal meaning to it. Okay? So the picture here of his hands and feet being pierced is that he's been attacked or he's being killed or harmed. All right? But we know that this psalm has messianic overtones, that it has connection to Christ. Okay, good. That was another challenging one there. Psalm verse, yes.
Can dogs also considered as metonymy?
Well, again, metonymy is one thing representing another. So in a sense, he is saying that dogs represent these men, but I think it's more than that. He's really calling them dogs. He's comparing them to dogs in the strongest way that he can. So it's not that these dogs represent them. He's actually referring to them, to his enemies, the band of evildoers, but he's comparing them in the strongest way possible, that they're dogs. All right. So I think that's a really good question, and I think you just have to understand sort of what he's doing here with that phrase. So I would see it as more than a metonymy, but more of a because he's calling them dogs. If it was clear that he just meant for a group of dogs to represent them, that would be the metonymy. But I think the difference is he's referring to them as dogs. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense?
Yes, Pastor.
Okay.
Dr. Tim,
Yes, sir.
can we say then that in reference to the word dog, what the author may mean is the characteristic of the dogs, the fierceness and the fierceness of what he is going through. Being encompassed may not necessarily mean literally surrounded, but everywhere he turns, the enemy is in front of him, something like that.
Yeah, I think whenever you have a comparison, either a simile, a metaphor, or hypocatastasis, you have to ask, okay, in this case, the comparison is the evildoers are compared to dogs, right? In the strongest form, strongest way. And so the question you have to ask then, well, what does he mean by this? And to find out what he means by this, you have to ask what are the characteristics of dogs? Or what characteristic of dogs is he speaking of? All right?
Yeah.
So is it their fierceness? Is it the fact that they attack? Remember, dogs in those days were roamed around in packs and were actually dangerous. Okay?
Yeah.
And that seems to be the picture here, is these men, these evildoers, are dangerous. That dogs were threatening, were dangerous, would attack, would form in packs. And so I think it's that picture that he's trying to communicate, that these evildoers are like that to him. He's threatened by them. He's surrounded by them. And then notice these dogs pierce his hands and his feet. Now, dogs don't know how to, pierce, but they do with their fangs. So the picture here seems to be not that they're hammering something, but actually that they're dogs, and that dogs, can grip with their fangs, with their teeth, and cause much harm. So to understand a comparison, you need to understand the thing being compared, and in this case, dogs. So what do we know about dogs and the characteristics of dogs that he's here? Excuse me? Oh. Okay. Does that answer your question, Brother Raleigh?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, good. All right. So, for example, right, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. That's a metaphor. And to understand the meaning of that statement, the Lord, Yahweh, is being compared to a shepherd. Well, what do we know about a shepherd? That's what he's trying to say. God is being compared to that. Shepherds protect their sheep. They care for their sheep. They lead their sheep. They provide for their sheep. All right, so that's the whole idea surrounded in the word shepherd in that comparison. Okay, let's go to Pastor DJ, Psalm 10, verse 7.
His mouth is full of curses and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue is mischief and wickedness. I think it's metaphor.
Okay, metaphor. What's a metaphor here? What phrase?
Uh, because of the use of is, his mouth is full of
Okay,
curses.
mouth. His mouth is. Okay, so let's look at this a minute. Full of curses. Now, what's being compared here then?
His
Remember,
mouth.
metaphor is a comparison.
His mouth. Oh wait. I think it's hyperbole.
Yeah, I think that's a better hyperbole, right? And where do we see the hyperbole here?
Because of the description of full of curses.
Yeah, is full. So it's a picture of, right? It's not, his mouth is not being compared to something. In other words, he would have said his mouth is a witch or something like that, right? That's a comparison. Here he's saying his mouth is full of something. It's full of curses. So it's like the picture of his mouth. He doesn't have food in his mouth. He has curses coming out of his mouth, and it's full, like a lot of curses. So I think hyperbole is the right understanding here. Do you see any others? I'll give you a hint. Mouth and tongue. Is his mouth literally where the curses reside?
No.
It's what he says, right?
Yeah.
So the mouth is representing something. The tongue is representing something.
So it's metonymy.
There you go. Metonymy. So the mouth and the tongue are part of the whole, and they represent his speech. Okay? So his mouth is like, he could have said his speech is full of curses, right? He speaks mischief and wickedness. But instead he uses metonymy, the mouth and the tongue, which are part of the speaking process, as representing his speech. So we would say mouth and tongue equals speech here. Metonymy. All right? Again, another challenging one. Not obvious till you think about it a little bit. But again, what you need to do is this, man. As you look at these phrases, you have to ask, is this literal? Okay? So when trying to determine if a figure of speech, a speech is being used, or figurative language, what you need to do is ask, is this phrase, oh man, my typing's horrible. Is this phrase meant literally? So if you look at his mouth is full of curses and deceit and oppression, is that a literal statement? Is he speaking of a mouth that's full of, well, no, curses are not an object, right? It's not like food or sand or rocks. Curses are, that's representing something that is said. Okay, so we know this is figurative. So then we ask, okay, is the phrase meant literally? And then the second is, how, if not, what is the figure of speech being used? So what you need to do is look at the phrase and just read the first phrase. Now, is that literal? No, it's not. It's figurative. It has a literal meaning, but it's a figurative expression. So he's not talking about a mouth sitting there that's got something, curses inside of it. Curses are, like I said, those aren't objects. They are, it's forms of speech, what you say. So it's figurative. So then we have to ask, okay, well, in what way is it figurative? Well, the mouth is representing his speech. His speech, what he says, is full of curses and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue, again, There's not a thing called mischief that you could lift up a guy's tongue and say, oh, look, there's mischief under his tongue. You see, yeah, you see any mischief there? No. What it would mean is what he says leads to mischief and wickedness. So we know that this is a figurative expression where tongue is representing his speech. And the tongue is part of what's used in the speaking process. Therefore, this is a metonymy. Okay? I know this is technical. I know this is being very specific and detailed, but it's helpful to be able to identify how the author is being, how he's being figurative. And when you can understand, and this is sort of the point of this, when I can understand the type of figurative speech that he's using, then I can see what the author is doing. All right? And that will help me in understanding. It's just another way that I'm examining the passage to give me a better understanding of what the author is doing. So if you have a poem and you see lots of hyperbole, then that's something that tells you something, that he's using a lot of exaggeration to make a point. If you see a lot of metonymy, he's using that figure of speech to kind of, rather than saying directly, he could have said here in verse 7, he speaks curses, deceit, and oppression. His speech causes mischief and wickedness. He could have said that, but this is a little more expressive and imaginative way to communicate the point. That's what gives poetry its creativity, its artistry, is by replacing these speech with this idea of his mouth, his tongue. It's a visual image that's being given. Okay? All right, let's do one more. All right, Brother Raleigh, we're going to give this one to you. Psalm 2, verse 10. Go ahead and read the passage, Brother Raleigh, and then identify what figure of speech you see here.
Now, therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warnings, O judges of the earth. I would say that it seems that it should be obvious that the king should be having, it should be obvious that kings should have discernment, and yet he is being called to show it. So parang,
think about this this expression here, O kings.
Yeah. O king, O judges.
Yeah, O judges. Those are I think that these are a form of figure of speech that he's using here. Do you remember what we called that?
Siret.
Does anyone remember? What do we call it when you have O kings, O judges? Huh?
Apostrophe.
Yeah. Think of it this way. Apostrophe. See that O?
Oh.
So when you see, oh. So how the English translations will often indicate this. Remember, this is called apostrophe or direct address. Okay, he's directly addressing someone here, like he's talking to them, the kings and the judges. So whenever you see this oh my soul, oh God, oh Yahweh, oh judges, that oh is the translator's way of indicating this is apostrophe, it's direct address. All right, so when you see that O, guys, just think of the word apostrophe with those two O's in it. Okay?
Yeah.
So everything else here is literal. Now, therefore, show discernment. He means that literally. take warning, judges of the earth. Here is sort of a figure of speech to kind of personalize, to emphasize, to direct it. He's not just speaking to everybody. Now, therefore, everybody show discernment. No, he's picking out a certain group of people and directing it towards them specifically. Okay?
So it's really more of a personal appeal to
Yes.
kings and judges.
Yeah. That's why we call it direct address, meaning he's addressing, he's speaking directly to a particular group here. It's not just a general statement. All right?
Okay. Thank you. Nice
All right.
tip.
Good job. Good job. All right, let's go ahead, and I've got several more examples. We'll pick up with those directly next week. We'll dive right in, and then Lord willing, we'll take a look at Psalm 99 and go through that psalm and identify the figurative language used there. Okay? Any final comments or questions before we? All right. You've had enough? You're saturated? Metonymy, synecdoche, metaphor, hypocatastasis. I had enough. Yes, Hebrew poetry. But
Can
you
I
know
just
this.
remove gallbladder?
What's that?
Can I just remove gallbladders and appendix?
But see, you need to know the difference between the two, don't you? It's pretty important. So that's the same with poetry. I think, you know, this is something maybe a lot of us aren't familiar with. And so this might seem technical or detailed or, you know, so many things to consider. But it's like anything. The more that you get experience with it, the more you do these exercises, that I think the more you'll see them more quickly, what's going on. And the more we can follow what an author is doing, the better we understand not just what he's saying, but the way he's saying it. And I think that will add to not just your understanding of the poem, but also how you communicate that understanding to the congregation or to those that you're teaching. All right? Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you, man. Pastor Atong, could you close our time in prayer?
Let's pray.